sometimes the language of the Psalms can just be a bit unrelatable, which is odd considering how most people find the Psalms so relatable. In my experience, when I ask others what part of the Bible is their favorite, the usual answer is the Psalms. That tends to be the popular answer. Everybody's favorite is the Psalms. It's just a popular piece of literature. And yet, some of the language, the metaphors, the imagery are simply just out of touch with modern life. Not all of it, but every so often it's glaringly obvious. For example, in this week's reading from Psalm 17, there is talk of personal enemies. And I just don't think that most people are walking around struggling individually, let alone with several who they would consider or call their enemy. I mean, maybe you have a list, and if so, I don't want to hear about it, but think about it for just a second. Do you have a long list of personal enemies? Like people who you could call an actual enemy? I don't think that's a common phenomenon. I just don't. You might have a difficult relationship with your boss, or you might have fallen out or be on bad terms with a friend, or even have a family member who you argue with incessantly. But to have an actual enemy, the way that the psalmist talks of enemies, is rather rare these days. Typically, when we think of enemies, we think on a larger scale. Nations have enemies. Ideals and values have enemies. Superheroes and fictional characters have villains and enemies. But average Joe doesn't have someone plotting their death in an evil lair. You just don't. And if you do, you should probably ask for help. A strange relationship? Sure. But an enemy? We do personally feel attacked at times by these greater threats, though. Certainly, the threat of dirty bombs and missile tests feels personally threatening. But we also rationally know that that threat is only personal in as much as you're a person within an entity that is a nation. There are some powerful people of world renown in this room, and I still don't think Russia is personally their enemy. It's just not how that works these days. It just feels a bit overly dramatic to take the language of enemy from Psalm 17 and to say that it applies today to the average person. And yet there is still something about this psalm that is still relatable. We could go abstract and we could make that happen, I guess. You may not have a flesh and blood arch nemesis, but we all have an enemy in the devil. We could do that. That'll preach. That ancient serpent, that lion ready to have a moment to pounce at any lurking corner that you're not expecting it. That's terrifying. And there's truth there. But I still don't think the average believer is walking around feeling the constant threat of Satan personally overshadowing their life like Psalm 17 describes. Maybe you should, but you don't. Not typically. We could also try to dilute this down and water it down until the meaning of enemy is something more relatable. Sure, I don't have my own personal supervillain with a vendetta against me, but there are people out there who make life difficult, who don't like me, or who would rather I not be successful at a variety of levels. Perhaps we can call those modern day enemies. Perhaps. But that does make Psalm 17 sound a bit overly dramatic and angsty, and well, just a bit much. To water down the enemy language in this psalm would also require that we proportionally dilute the pleading to God for help and salvation. Do you really need to cry out to God to shelter you from the person tailgating you? Maybe, but that's not the same thing as somebody trying to kill David. Or does the coworker who doesn't like you, or the family member who won't stop arguing with you during election season, does that really qualify for this kind of language from Psalm 17? Maybe, but that seems a bit much, doesn't it? I mean, not in the realm of Facebook. That's totally par for the course there. But in terms of reading Psalm 17 and saying that, yeah, I've got one of those enemies just like David, it seems a bit overdramatic. I don't think we walk around with enemies like that anymore. So how exactly do we go on liking and relating to this particular psalm if we don't have an enemy in the same sense that the psalmist seems to have had, without being angsty about it? How is it this psalm can still feel relatable without being overly dramatic? Perhaps the answer lies with who you are rather than with who someone else is in relation to you. In other words, this has less to do with your enemies and more to do with you. You see, regardless of whether or not you have an enemy, and regardless of what kind of threat your enemy poses to you, this psalm is still for you in that it offers advice for everyone. Even though we might not all have an enemy, we do all have a moral imperative. That's universal. Yes, you see that the circumstances of this psalm seem to be driven in large part by the very real threat of very real enemies. True, but the response the psalmist offers is relatable and applicable to everyone, with or without enemies of any kind. This psalmist is exemplifying the need for integrity in the face of evil, whatever that evil looks like. Integrity knows no bounds in that regard. And though evil can wear many faces, integrity always looks the same. In Psalm 17, the psalmist makes a detailed report to God of all the evil things that his enemies had done, and that he had also refrained from doing in return. Here again, just a few verses from the beginning of the psalm, and see the case the psalmist is making for his own integrity. If you try my heart, you visit me by night, you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. As for what others do, well, by the word of your lips, I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths, and my feet have not slipped. That's a really roundabout way of saying, I didn't do what everybody else did. Everybody else did wrong by me, but I did right by you. Which again, I think is a roundabout way of saying, I held my integrity intact. Sometimes in the face of evil, that's all there's left to do, no matter what your enemies look like. See, this is always all about integrity, the ability, the willingness to do what is right in the presence of those who would do you wrong. And though you do not have an arch nemesis, or if you do, again, you should probably see somebody about that, you're still capable of choosing integrity in your daily life, whatever that scale is. You're still capable of choosing to do what is right. You can and you should choose to do what is right, to live by God's standard of living rather than stooping to the world's standards or expectations of what is allowable. We, like the psalmist, should hold fast to righteousness, especially in the face of the temptation to return evil with evil. What does that look like? How does that play out in today's world? The fight for integrity takes place on a soccer field out in an elementary school every single Saturday with a bunch of 7-year-olds. Every Saturday, I sit and watch children choose a future path of either integrity or cheating. And that fight is real. What does it look like? I have a daughter who has asked me to keep her name out of sermons, who is 7 years old and plays soccer every Saturday. And every Saturday, without fail, enemies are made. And you might not have an enemy, but 7-year-old soccer players, they certainly do. They certainly do. And I've heard the strategy before. I've seen grown adults huddle with 7-year-olds and say, look at the girls on the other team. Each of you pick one. And that is your person for the day. And they have now decided, walked on, somebody looks at my daughter and decides she is the enemy for the next hour. And they treat her as such. And it usually starts out rather harmless. There's a bit of a routine to a 7-year-old soccer game. it usually starts friendly in the sense of the ball's kind of there in the field and everybody looks at it and says, would you like a turn with the ball? And they take turns kicking it back and forth, and it's very cordial. But you get about 15 minutes and somebody's already taken a ball to the face. And you're pretty sure it could have been on purpose. And so that cordiality doesn't last for very long. And at some point during the game, my nameless daughter will come to the sidelines and point out to me that she's being pushed, shoved, held, knocked over, kicked on purpose with cleats. And those things happen on a regular, every week basis. And we debrief after each game and talk about integrity, because that's what she's learning from soccer. She's learning integrity. And that seems like an unfair burden for a 7-year-old, but here we are. It starts young in this culture, I think, the fight for integrity. And she believes in it firmly. And she refuses to tell the coaches that she's being kicked with cleats, and she refuses to kick back. And she goes home every week knowing that she had to truly struggle to keep her integrity intact in a soccer game that was supposed to be recreational fun. That's a real fight for her. Constantly on her mind. So much so that she actually got recognized on the school announcements to the whole school for her integrity in her classroom. She shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to do that. But in this world, you might not have an arch enemy with an evil layer who wears spandex, but you do always, from the time that you were 7 or younger to the end of your days, have a constant fight to protect your integrity. And it may not look like soccer and cleats, but there's going to be a moment coming to you sometime soon, or already has this morning, or will later today, when your integrity will be up for grabs. And if you don't take hold of it fast, somebody else might throw it away. That is a real struggle. It's always been there. I contend that that's one of the ways that devil, that serpent, that lion pounces the quickest. Is not in some form of October thrill of demon possession, but is in the subtly chipping away of your integrity over time. That's truly terrifying. Because what do you expect to happen to a 7-year-old who has to fight so hard for integrity as they get older? You know the story as grown-ups. You know what this feels like. Eventually you wake up one day and you decide you're just tired. Having to fight so hard to hold on to doing what is right when it would just be so much easier to give up and give in and just do it the way the rest of the world does it. But you as a believer also know that there is something about being able to look in a mirror and tell God face to face in that moment that you did everything you could to stand for what was right in the times it was the most difficult. And that is not an easy struggle. It's a hard battle. Some fights are easier than others, but I guarantee everyone in this room has that one moment, whether it's a cleat or not. You have that one temptation out there that always nags at you that you think it would just be so much easier if I didn't have to do it the right way. And that might be a little thing, it might be a big thing, but in reality, it's the biggest thing of them all. Because what's at stake here is your ability to tell God with honesty that you chose to do what was right. It's to be with the psalmist and tell God, look at me, examine my life. I did what was right. Even though everyone else treated me with violence or cleats or whatever it is, I still did what was right. So my nameless 7-year-old daughter can tell me honestly every Saturday morning that she didn't push back, even though she really wanted to. And I hope that all of these mature grown-ups in the room can have the same level of integrity as that 7-year-old. But I imagine that's one of those things that gets harder with age. There's a reason why Jesus tells us to be like children. Quite a few of them, in fact. Children haven't been spoiled by the world yet. They haven't been beaten down relentlessly yet, though it does start young. Some of those reasons that Jesus tells us to be like children is because children have an easier time of believing, and faith comes easier to children. And that's a beautiful thing, but that's a sermon for another day. Today, at least, the reason why I think Jesus tells us to be like children is because children understand the importance of integrity in a way that adults might be willing to compromise. Be like a child who doesn't push back in a soccer game might sound insignificant, but the stakes they couldn't be any higher. Be like a child. Because every Saturday, as I watch that soccer game, and I want to do something about the people who are pushing and kicking and hitting my daughter, my integrity is tested too. And I learned from her so many important lessons. But the lesson I learn every Saturday as I watch her preserve her integrity at all costs is how to do the same in my own life, so that I can look her in the eyes at the same time that I tell her that integrity is important, and honestly be able to tell her that I try to protect mine too. And some days that's harder than others. I hope for all of you that this doesn't relate to any of you. My greatest prayer for every single sermon I preach is that it has nothing to do with any of you, that you can't relate to any of this, that it's just totally useless because you're beyond it and everything's fine in your world. That's what I always hope. I hope none of you have to fight for your integrity. I hope that you are just so good at it that it comes naturally and it's not a struggle at all. But just whenever you think that you've got that in the bag, might be the time you're most vulnerable to attack. So be on guard. Preserve your childhood innocence. Do what is right when no one is looking, and especially do what is right when everyone else is doing what is wrong, so that you can face God one day and with honesty and pride and love tell God that you tried your best to do what was right at all the times, not just when someone was watching. So that God can look back on you and say, I watched the whole time and I saw you do that. And it was wonderful. The psalmist lives in that space. So you don't have an evil enemy and an evil lair, but you still are struggling in that epic battle for your own integrity. And don't give up. Never give up and never give in. And if you don't want to remember any of that, or if you've already fallen asleep because you stayed up too late cooking your chili, at least hear this. This table represents integrity. This meal is the very embodiment of integrity, of Jesus who chose to do what was right when everyone else would do the ultimate harm to him. What else does integrity look like besides the cross? It's what I tell my nameless 7-year-old daughter week after her soccer games. Jesus also had to fight for his integrity, and sometimes it hurts. That's what this meal is. It's integrity. And we take that and we put it within us. We hold on to it tight. We can hold on for one more week, and then we come back and do it again. Renew your integrity at this meal. Renew your strength. Renew your courage to live differently and against the current of the world, to do what is right by God's eyes, not what is right by everyone else's. Come find that at this table.